Most Americans take constitutional legitimacy for granted, leaving the Supreme Court and its illustrious bar to do their work without concern for political philosophy. A great and unique strength of the work of the James Wilson Institute is our sustained effort to dislodge that philosophical complacency in our jurisprudence, in our law schools, and among our fellow citizens like those of you this evening. We owe it to the nation to consider why our Constitution is legitimate before we decide how it should be interpreted. To do this, the James Wilson Institute brings us closer to the 18th century intellectual world, commonly known as the founding. Constitutionalism of the founding was intimately tied to questions of political philosophy based in part on the idea of natural rights. Too many modern constitutional historians and law professors have disparaged the importance of natural rights. The James Wilson Institute deserves credit and all of our support for pushing back on this idea. Natural rights featured prominently in the founding era in their constitutional thought. It is an inheritance we must study, teach, and sustain for every American generation. With that, I would ask you if you turn off your devices, that would be helpful. Disarm, if you will. Return to the analog age, where people talk to each other without these things. We're going to have our founder and co-director, Hadley Arkus, introduce our guest speaker tonight. Hadley.
Whoa, I'm wary of stairs after seeing Joe Biden. Whoa, I'm glad I made it. Look, thanks for coming. It's good to see so many old friends back again. You know, when we launched this senior seminar of ours 12 years ago, we decided we'd open on Friday evening where everybody comes together. We open in a different way from what we do usually in the seminar on Saturday. In that first meeting, we had my dear friend, Alan Greenberg, the South African emigre who became a preeminent figure in restoring classical architecture in America. We had Alan in to do a knockout talk, always good, about the connection between the natural law principles of the founding and the architecture of the period. Years later, we had the same subject approach from a different angle by my longtime friend and former colleague at Amherst, Bill Westphal, who had been dean of the School of Architecture at Notre Dame to reinforce a bent toward classicism there. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing a close friend who's known both Alan and Bill, but who's done even more now to resist modernism and brutalism in architecture and promoting, you might say, the best things said and done. Catesby has moved through the years through elegant essays, dealing not only with architecture, but with monuments and painting. And he sought to explain precisely what there was to be appreciated, savored, promoted, and what should be triggering our recoil, as with the Eisenhower Memorial done by Gary. The irony is that the average man is naturally drawn to the classical modes, which take their bearing from the human person and the mode of living for the human person. The nearest and simplest concern of architecture for the human person is the house. In Europe, we'd find the palace of justice, but in America, we'd have, as Alan Greenberg used to say, the courthouse, the state house, the jailhouse. We used to say that the average man will look at the Parthenon and know it's not a hamburger stand. You know, the grammar of architecture will help him notice a building directed to a high public purpose, say the city hall or the federal courthouse, as opposed to an office building. Ordinary people grasp these things. It takes a heavy dose of theory, thickly applied over the years, to persuade some architects that these differences don't matter, that an office building looking like an ice cube tray may serve as a palace of justice if we simply put that name on the building with an elegant plaque. Catesby has been one of the strong voices in arguing against the mediocrity that would pass itself off as high architecture. And what he's done there is explain to us just what it is that commands both our taste and our reason. our taste and our reason in the best things done in civic monuments. The Lutyens' War Memorial, the Cenotaph in London, or that remarkable new monument to the soldiers who fought in the First World War, that new monument opposite the Willard Hotel, in which Catesby is written. In all these things, I'd say Catesby has been giving us an exquisite tutorial. Catesby is a Washingtonian through and through. He grew up in Georgetown. He'd go on to college at Princeton, but then plunge into a career in journalism by reporting on politics in South America. But that experience in South America drew his interest in buildings and architecture. When he returned to the States, he found the architectural historian Henry Hope Reed in his fine book, The Golden City. And that was reinforced by the critical work by Geoffrey Scott on the Architecture of Humanism. As Catesby says, both books rejected the premises of the modernist secession from the humanist tradition. Catesby has been a leading voice in seeking to restore that humanist tradition in the places that matter. The Wall Street Journal, the City Journal, First Things, and other journals that bring him to a larger public audience of the literate. He's become, in fact, I think, our preeminent critic in the arts of architecture, sculpture, and painting. In the current issue of the Claremont Review, he has a review of Rick Brookhuiser's new book on Jonathan Trumbull, the painter who produced many memorable scenes from the period of the founding. Trumbull seemed to be quite confident of his own artistic judgment until he arrived in Paris, seeking instruction. And as Brookhuiser tells us, he was overwhelmed by what he encountered in the ray of the paintings, but also by Versailles and the gardens. Catesby quotes Trumbull's reflection on Rubens' paintings of Maria de' Medici. Trumbull said that the artist had discerned splendor and harmony wonderfully united, the truth of nature and the glow of a nature superior to ours. The glow of a nature superior to ours. That recognition of things higher and lower in nature is quite compatible with the principle of natural equality at the core of the American founding. Catesby said that those words of Trumbull's reflect classical, timeless classical principles. And he said it might seem strange these days that those principles accord with the political principles of the founding. It would not have seemed strange, he said, to Washington or Jefferson. There's a difference, of course, between the aesthetic of Trumbull and the philosophic premises of the founding, but as Catesby says, it's precisely because they are alike grounded in the enduring realities of nature that they stand to benefit mankind. In other words, we're back with the natural law because we've never left it. And so would you join me in welcoming Catesby to the lectern?
The problem with being introduced by Hadley is he's given a better lecture than you ever will. Classical architecture essentially involves an idealization of structure that resonates with us as embodied beings. Different classes of people might respond to it in different ways, but at the end of the day, everybody gets the Parthenon and everybody gets the Lincoln Memorial. The classical canons The classical canon's various architectural orders comprising columns and the entablatures or superstructures they support is the central thread in its DNA. The order's formal and proportional variety allows them to endow buildings and different parts of buildings with distinct characters. The canon is served as the wellspring of stylistic development in Western architecture, what we might call a broadening humanistic stream, including the Baroque, the Romanesque, the Gothic, the Rococo, and even Art Deco. Humanistic architecture is premised on composition in which minor forms are subordinated to major forms in a way that endows a building with a coherent physiognomy analogous to that of the human body. The humanistic roots of the classical canon are embodied by the caryatids, serving as columnar elements on the famous Erechtheium porch in Athens. The tectonic essence of both the classical architectural canon and classical sculpture is expressed on that porch. The Parthenon's sculptural decoration, which has never been surpassed, revolves around the structural idealization of the human body. It was not a classicist, but an English exponent of the Gothic revival who defined architecture as the decoration of construction a century and a half ago. The word decoration requires scrutiny. It does not merely refer to the embellishment of construction. The Latin word decor denotes comeliness or elegance, it is true, but it is also the root of the word decorum, which means fittingness or propriety. It is a fundamental principle of the historic architecture of the West that the architectural art entails the creation of buildings that are recognizably suitable or appropriate to the purposes they serve. It is therefore most appropriate that the classical canon should have first emerged in the design of temples and reached a pinnacle of refinement in the architecture and sculptural decoration of the Parthenon, while the design of interior space reached a new height of sophistication in a later temple. The Pantheon in Rome. The ancient temple was sanctified, literally set apart from other structures by its architectural character. But over time, the canon and the conventions and styles that developed out of it served to ennoble other building types, public assembly halls, stoas and basilicas, schools, palaces, public baths, and later on, any number of additional building types, churches figuring very prominently among them. Sorry about this. The instinctively humanistic orientation of the classical tradition is reflected by the triumphal arch developed by the Romans, with the springing of its curvilinear portion corresponding to the arms of Leonardo's Vitruvian Man extended outward, and the curve above corresponding to his arms extended upward. Architectural decorum involves endowing classical structures with formal qualities that allow them to idealize the various realms of human endeavor and embody the sense of the community, whether religious, civic, or academic, as an entity of greater import than the self, as an entity incorporating not only the living, but the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. Since World War II, architecture has rejected this immemorial mission, and we might add, all but abolished architecture's metaphysical content, which is implicit in the idealization of structure. This sorry state of affairs isn't going to change anytime soon. The question is whether our public architecture, including buildings erected by the federal government, can help nurture an artistic counterculture. Let's take a historical tour in order to put things in perspective. In the colonial period, very fine buildings were erected in Georgian modes, imbued with a classical sense of proportion and detail. The old State House in Boston is a superb example. As is the first Capitol building in Williamsburg, which we saw before that. It was Thomas Jefferson who sought to impart a more emphatically monumental character to the new state capitol in Richmond, which we see in this old stereograph. The lofty Ionic portico and the array of pilasters extending from it were the essential means to that end. Completed in 1788, the Capitol was situated on a prominent site overlooking the James. When we compare the building to the Roman prototype Jefferson visited and fervently admired, it is obvious that the Virginia Capitol is a rather crude production. That is to be expected of a new nation that was not yet rich. It is Jefferson's aspiration to emulate the great achievements of the past that matters. The original United States Capitol was a much better building, featuring a dome akin to the Roman pantheons. As enlarged during the 1850s and 60s, it is one of the classical tradition's most significant American achievements. The orders are conspicuously deployed, and the proportional relationship between the new dome and the building's broad lateral extensions is majestic. The dome reflects the form's development during the Italian Renaissance, as at St. Peter's in Rome. One of the fruits of the Capitol's expansion was the apotheosis of Washington, the astonishing 4,664 square foot work in fresco by the Italian-born Constantino Brumidi in the new dome's canopy. Now, Thomas Walter, the architect of the Capitol expansion, was an adherent of a school of architecture that emphasized the structural character of classical architecture as opposed to its decorative embellishment. Walter long opposed Brumidi's important role in decorating Capitol committee rooms and corridors, in which the influence of the Renaissance master Raphael is readily evident. It was the Army engineer in charge of the Capitol's expansion, Montgomery C. Meigs, future Quartermaster General of the Union Army, who insisted on Brumidi's involvement, a lesson in the importance of enlightened patronage. Walter's aesthetic found expression in the Greek Revival, and the imposing structure we see here is clearly focused on structural rather than decorative character. The Greek Revival was one of a series of architectural modes that came to the fore during a period of more or less confused eclecticism that only ended toward the end of the 19th century. It was the best of those modes, as this charming old federal building in Galveston and numerous others akin to it attest, and the only one that has major relevance to contemporary traditional practice. The Smithsonian Castle is a Washington landmark, but the architect's excessive striving for picturesque effect is a hallmark of this period of confusion. Richard Morris Hunt, a great architect who was the first American to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designed this forlorn ensemble in a Victorian Gothic idiom. The Connecticut Capitol in Hartford is something of a Victorian goulash with noticeable French elements, as with Hunt's ensemble in New Haven, and a classically symmetrical layout. The Eisenhower building next to the White House was designed in the bombastic Second Empire style imported from France by way of England. Among the finest achievements of this eclectic period was Henry Hobson Richardson's Allegheny County Courthouse and Jail. Richardson was the second American to attend the Parisian École, and the massing and proportions of this complex, whose stylistic origins lie in French Romanesque architecture antedating the Gothic's medieval rise to preeminence, make a very powerful impression. But Richardson's style has a limited expressive range, and few managed it well in any event, as we see with this poorly integrated federal structure in western New York State. Chattanooga boasts a better building in the Richardsonian manner, but it falls well short of the Pittsburgh ensemble, and in any event, the style had about run its course. Months after this post office opened, the most important architectural event in American history made its debut. It was the World's Columbian Exposition, which was staged in Chicago on Lake Michigan's western shore in 1893. It did not involve the erection of permanent buildings. This being a fair, the architecture was temporary, clad in plaster bonded with shredded hemp. The exposition's classical centerpiece was the Court of Honor and its grand basin. The court was terminated at its east end by a peristyle or colonnade, in front of which stood Daniel Chester French's hieratic statue of the Republic. At the opposite end stood the administration building, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, architect of those very differently conceived Yale Divinity School buildings. The court's scenographic effect was overwhelming, and this explains more than anything why the fair attracted such a tremendous number of visitors, more than 27 million over 6 months. The population of the United States recorded by the census 3 years before the fair was 63 million. Large, richly decorated monumental structures housed exhibits devoted to agriculture, machinery, manufactures, mines, and electricity. Plazas and esplanades were replete with sculpture, fountains, flagpoles, and balustrades. The exposition's impact was such that serious thought was given to making the Court of Honor and its buildings permanent. An exceptionally handsome classical structure devoted to the fine arts and located elsewhere on the grounds was in fact rebuilt in permanent form and now houses Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry. But the influential New York architecture critic Montgomery Schuyler was hostile to such notions, and not for reasons of practicality. "Men bring not back the mastodon," he proclaimed in an essay published months after the fair's close. He was referring directly to the exposition's physical resurrection, but the comment was, of course, a double entendre. For Schuyler, the classical grandeur of Athens, Rome, Paris, and yes, Washington, of whose architectural impact on the public he was well aware, was obsolete as a model for contemporary practice. Architecture, no less than scientific knowledge, technology, or organic nature itself, must evolve. It was past time to give authentic expression to the new building technologies, especially steel construction technology, that the industrial age had ushered in. Thomas U. Walter had done precisely the opposite with the cast iron dome. He designed for the United States Capitol. Walter's dome is painted so as to appear more real. Schuyler portrayed the Chicago Fair in terms of the entertainment of a holiday crowd, the architect's achievement as the stage setting for an unexampled spectacle, and a fairy city utterly divorced from and antithetical to true architecture, which he defined in starkly materialistic terms as, quote, the correlation of structure and function, unquote. If architecture is to be, quote, real and living and progressive, unquote, Schuyler added, its forms must be the results of material and construction. We see wholly mistaken modernist dogma adumbrated in Schuyler's commentary on the Chicago Fair. His assessment of the exposition's architectural ramifications was hamstrung by a pseudo-scientific materialism. The misapplication of scientific dogma to the arts of form is one of the titanic blunders of the modern age. Among other things, this fallacy leads inexorably to architecture's conversion from technology's master into technology's slave. We are fortunate that Henry Adams recorded his thoughts on the fair in his famous autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams. Adams, patrician grandson of one American president and great-grandson of another, may have worshipped the Gothic of Chartres and resided in a rather gloomy Romanesque mansion in Washington designed by Richardson. But he was profoundly moved by what he called the Court of Honor's inconceivable scenic display. Sitting on the steps of the administration building, Adams pondered the fact that the Chicago Fair, though dedicated largely to the exhibition of the nation's dizzying technological progress, involving everything from ocean steamers to explosives, had taken an altogether different tack with regard to architecture. Here, he wrote, was a breach of continuity, a rupture in historical sequence. Was it real or only apparent? Adams then dismissed deterministic schemes of historical progress such as Schuyler's. He dared to hope that, quote, the new American world would take this sharp and conscious turn towards ideals, unquote. His conclusion, Chicago was the first expression of American thought as a unity. One must start there. Adams reached that bold conclusion because the exposition embodied the aspiration that America's material progress should not be an end in itself, but rather serve the higher purpose of creating a great American civilization. His phrase, conscious turn towards ideals, is particularly noteworthy, and its significance would not have been lost on the men who designed the Court of Honor. The U.S. Capitol is classical because the aesthetic sensibilities and ideals of the founders, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson especially, were classical. And the architects who designed the Court of Honor at Chicago, foremost among whom was Charles Fallon McKim of McKim, Mead and White, the most important architectural office of the era, were well aware of that. The Chicago Fair exercised a profound influence on American architecture for over 40 years. It coincided with the emergence of a new breed of American architects who were either trained at the École in Paris or at American universities, where architectural training was strongly influenced by the École. These architects had a much more assured grasp of mass and proportion, detail, and the progression of interior spaces in monumental design than was typically the case with their predecessors. When we compare the ill-proportioned pile in Council Bluffs, Iowa, with the courthouse and post office in Anniston, Alabama, we get an idea of what the Chicago Fair meant for America's civic art and federal patronage in particular. McKim's Penn Station, whose design was largely inspired by the baths of Caracalla in Rome, was one of American architecture's supreme creations. Grand Central Terminal, thankfully still with us, offers perhaps the finest example of the structural idealization of the human body to be found in America's public sculpture. This Dallas train station is one of a multitude of exemplary works of the period, many of which were federal buildings such as the Alexander Hamilton Custom House in Lower Manhattan. The sculptural decoration of this building was of exceptional quality, as was the embellishment of this federal courtroom in Cleveland, which features a mural painting in a pre-Raphaelite style. San Francisco is home to some of the most remarkable achievements of the period. This federal appeals court that dates to the turn of the last century is notable for its powerfully rusticated masonry. And here's the great Arthur Brown's City Hall. In this instance, French influence is quite pronounced, not least in the dome. The building's stair hall is one of the nation's greatest interior spaces. Brown designed a nearby federal office building 2 decades later, along with the masterful interdepartmental building that extends the length of 2 long city blocks in Washington's Federal Triangle. The building's centerpiece is an auditorium named after Andrew W. Mellon, the Treasury Secretary who launched the Triangle Redevelopment Project, the last great expression of the urban ideal that emerged at the Chicago Fair. Boston's Government Center ranks among its dystopian modernist counterparts. Work in different stylistic idioms benefited from the salutary influence of the fair and the architects of the Court of Honor. Consider 2 conspicuous buildings on Chicago's magnificent mile. the classical Wrigley Building on the left and the Gothic Tribune Tower on the right. Both date to the 1920s. It is noteworthy how successfully new structural technologies, Pache, Montgomery Schuyler, were accommodated time and again by the humanist architectural tradition. Lower Manhattan boasts examples, including the great Cass Gilbert's, also Gothic, Woolworth Building, and the Dinkins Municipal Building, whose architectural forms largely derive from the Italian Renaissance. The latter boasts a stunningly monumental colonnade. The old Standard Oil Building is located a short distance down Broadway from the Woolworth. Its design astutely accommodates the avenue's curvaceous trajectory. Ventilated steam, so I'm told, once issued from its crowning tripod-supported brazier. A fair distance uptown, we have one of the most popular buildings in the United States, the Art Deco Empire State Building, whose superb massing, particularly evident at the top, reflects the architect's classical training. Cass Gilbert, however, adhered to classical forms in designing the Thurgood Marshall U.S. Courthouse on Foley Square, not far from his Woolworth Building. The courthouse's tower is mounted on a base with a superb portico. But modernism had been in the air for a while by now. The age needed to express its distinct identity. The question was what form modernism would take. Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue had offered an answer in 1921, an answer not wholly unrelated, in formal terms at least, to the Empire State Building that came a decade later. Goodhue, justly revered for superb Gothic churches such as the chapel at West Point, envisioned a convocation tower as the world's first structure exceeding 1,000 feet in height. It would not be an exercise in corporate advertising, and such advertising unquestionably was a factor in American skyscrapers' relentless quest for new heights. Goodhue's tower would house the offices of Protestant denominations. It would include a church from which a profusion of light emanates in this rendering. And there would be, of course, as you can see, a cross at the summit. Goodhue's Nebraska Capitol, whose tower rises a not inconsiderable 400 feet, is the closest he came to realizing his soaring vision. But one might wish his idea of modernism had endured, not as an exclusive option, but as part of a widening stream of humanistic architectural expression. His one-time partner, Ralph Adams Cram, another brilliant practitioner of Gothic, and sufficiently influential that he made it onto the cover of Time magazine, advocated tradition plus modernism in his superb memoir, My Life in Architecture. Cram's vision was that modernism would find expression in the skyscraper. And he is, in fact, the architect of this fine, modern, high-rise federal building in Boston, reflecting his vision. During this period, he continued to do superb Gothic work, as with his cathedral like East Liberty Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh, which, he bragged, could be set up for a Catholic high mass in 30 minutes. He was Princeton's university architect for some 20 years, and his salutary influence on campus architecture is evident in this enchanting collegiate quadrangle at Berry College in Georgia, which was underwritten by Henry Ford. Before we leave off the topic of the Chicago Fair's impact, it's worth noting that Uncle Sam continued to enrich far-flung American communities, such as Thermopolis, Wyoming, with very fine buildings during the 1930s. Such much-loved edifices reflect the age-old conception of architecture as an art of decorum. An art intended to enrich our daily lives with buildings that communicate the significance of the purposes they serve, whether it be governance, commerce, education, worship, dwelling. Or transportation, so memorably symbolized by the Mercury figure at Grand Central Terminal. By the outbreak of World War II, however, the culture of building that had nurtured so much of our nation's finest architecture was running out of steam. The Knicks building in Philadelphia is rather lumpen in its modernistic architectural character. It is thoroughly modern in that it incorporated a new technological innovation, centralized or central air conditioning. No need to break building masses up to provide ventilation as well as sunlight, as with Cram's McCormick building in Boston. This decorative sculpture panel is rather lumpen too, even the eagle displaying a hypertrophic musculature. After World War II, the humanist stream in American architecture was diverted into a status of complete irrelevance from which it has been very slow to emerge. To get an idea of the ramifications, here is the New York Central office building on Park Avenue with the rather forbidding bulk of the Met Life building behind it. Obviously, corporate space requirements had increased a great deal by the time the Met Life Colossus was completed in 1962. But the humanist tradition had always shown itself to be capable of adapting to new programmatic as well as technological demands, and the later building's vast dimensions could have nurtured a truly sublime vision. Two trends would run against such humanistic sublimity. First, influential architects like Walter Gropius, who collaborated on the MetLife building's design, rejected the great tradition in Western architecture in favor of a new architecture grounded in what Gropius was pleased to call the New World Order of the Machine. A more concise expression of a dehumanized aesthetic is hard to imagine. A second and closely related development was the tendency for modernist buildings to resemble functionalist commodities rather than artifacts. That seems to be a reasonable distinction between the New York Central and MetLife buildings, or the old People's Gas building on Chicago's Michigan Avenue, and its rather depressing neighbors of more recent vintage, or between the Standard Oil building and its Broadway neighbor to the south. Here's a fuller picture of that neighbor. By the way, neuroscience is telling us that the organic complexity of the older facades engages the human eye, while the crudely simplistic patterns of the later ones repel it. Of course, we're speaking of the responses of normal people, as opposed to graduates of Ivy League architecture schools. When Daniel Patrick Moynihan drew up his guiding principles for federal architecture in 1962, the Seagram building, designed by one of modernism's principal pioneers, appears to have been what he hoped would eventuate from his suggestion that an official style, meaning classicism, be avoided. Mies van der Rohe's Federal Center, which went up in Chicago during the 1960s and 70s, is relentlessly rectilinear and severely reductionist. It breathes corporate efficiency, not civic ideals. Does the Philip Burton U.S. courthouse in San Francisco, which reflects the same simplistic character we saw in those post-war high-rise facades a short while back, embody Americans' aspiration to a more perfect union? Is it architecturally appropriate to the lofty ideal of equal justice under law? Of course not. It resembles a commercial office building, which is to say, a functionalist commodity. It would never have gone up but for the advent of that threadbare doctrine of a new world order of the machine. And in fact, it was designed by a pupil of Walter Gropius. One of the best modernist skyscrapers in the United States is of at least partially Miesian inspiration, what is now called the Willis Tower, noteworthy for its astute massing and the picturesque accents afforded by its pair of crowning antennae, which were added a decade after the building's completion. The problem is, you can't build a meaningful city with such a limited formal vocabulary, a dehumanized vocabulary that excludes ornament. Even modernist critics acknowledge that this gaggle of Miesian skyscrapers a short distance down Park Avenue from the Seagram building has degraded the avenue. More recent super tall condominium buildings like this one, 432 Park Avenue, have degraded Manhattan's skyline while catering to the super rich thirsting for eye-popping vistas. Brutalism, currently a matter of nostalgia for our culturati, as recently indicated by a buzz-generating film entitled The Brutalist, originated with Le Corbusier's viral reaction against modernist reductionism. That reaction is abundantly evident in this forbidding contraption, which he inflicted on the French countryside. Hopefully, the nostalgia's concrete, as opposed to critical ramifications, will be limited. After all, the style gave us what is widely considered the ugliest building in the United States, the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover headquarters. On the other hand, if the intended architectural message is abandon all hope, ye who enter here, brutalism might be just the ticket, as long as we don't lose sight of the cruel and unusual punishment issue. Here is a U.S. courthouse in Miami whose pilotis, or structural supports and bizarre massing suggest Corbusian influence. It reminds me of a modernist commentator's hostile reaction to The Brutalist, the movie, which concerns the troubled adjustment of a Hungarian Bauhaus graduate who was also a Holocaust survivor to life in post-war America. To his patron, now I'm quoting the critic, quote, "The architect says of his built work back in Budapest," quote again, "My buildings will endure. I expect them to remain," end of the architect, the Bauhaus architect's quote. Any such notion of architecture, the critic says, would have been a pathetic anathema to Dessau or Bauhaus trained architects of this character's generation. After the industrialized perfection of warfare, the Spanish flu, and the social and political collapse of the orders of the 1870s, they sought an unremaining architecture, as fast and replaceable as that era's sports cars and biplanes, and all the more so after the war that followed. Then as now, the idea was, to coin a phrase, move fast and break stuff. You know, when you think about it, this commentator isn't really speaking of an artistic ethos. He's speaking of a business model. Disposable architecture like this courthouse, architecture that is not expected to stand the test of time and doesn't deserve to, generates more work for whom? Cui bono? I'd say it benefits the modernist establishment. One thing modernism does not suffer from is stylistic consistency. Unlike humanist architecture's widening stylistic stream, modernism is like a freeway with off-ramps that quickly lead to dead ends. Failure leads modernist theorists and practitioners back onto the freeway until they hit the next exit ramp and the next dead end. Of course, they suffer fits of nostalgia while cruising down the freeway, as is happening with brutalism these days. But at least there is heterogeneity. One of the more engaging modernist buildings in the United States, the old TWA terminal at JFK Airport in New York, hardly kowtows to a new world order of the machine, whether in its sculpturesquely aviary and exterior configuration or in its expressionistically curvilinear interior. The terminal's interior is over the top, and yet it did succeed as an engaging space in which travelers could see and be seen. Saarinen, as some of us, the architect Saarinen, as some of us might attest, had considerably less success at Dulles Airport, where the interior suffers from a catenary ceiling that is apt to remind us of a sagging mattress. JFK, in any event, is a one-off. Architecture and sculpture are two different things, and you cannot fill an airport with bird terminals. It would look ridiculous. More recent buildings by the Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava, one, a museum pavilion resembling a particularly pretentious airport building, the other resembling the abstracted skeleton of some critter from the dinosaur age, show the limitations of this biomorphic approach to architecture, the serious limitations. In his guiding principles, Moynihan insisted on design reflecting regional character. This fine federal building in San Antonio, with its tile roof and Baroque finials, has a subtly Hispanic character. What about this new courthouse, U.S. courthouse in the same city? It could be anywhere. And it reflects, more than anything, modernist architects' infatuation with glass, a material that does not age well, but whose use they justify as evocative of democratic transparency. I'm not sure that's what the public thinks of when it looks at this building. This courthouse's main advantage is that the public doesn't think we can erect buildings like its predecessor anymore. Not all federal buildings of recent vintage are awful. The postmodern Theodore Roosevelt U.S. Courthouse in Brooklyn aspires to a civic character and an engaging presence. But where is that consistent appropriateness of aesthetic intent evident in the older government buildings? You certainly don't find it in this brutally misbegotten U.S. courthouse in Austin, which suggests an ill-conceived Rubik's Cube. Here's a federal courthouse in Salt Lake City that Senator Mike Lee likened to a giant air conditioning unit. Locals, however, refer to it as the Borg Cube. Maybe not Corbusian, but pretty brutal all the same. And here, just across the street from that fine appeals court building in San Francisco, is the federal office building designed by a perennial enfant terrible, Tom Main. I'd say this deconstructionist monstrosity is every bit as bad as the J. Edgar Hoover building. By way of art, it features a curious light show. Sky Garden. I'm sure the lawyers in this audience will appreciate this work. Stare Decisis at Maine's courthouse in Oregon. Because of its bright red color and the curvaceous contrast it strikes with the buildings around it, Alexander Calder's Flamingo is reputedly popular. But where is the civic symbolism? What is obviously needed to improve Uncle Sam's architectural patronage, and indeed America's architectural culture, are more government buildings of classically oriented design. This addition to an older U.S. courthouse in the state capital of Montgomery, Alabama, is noteworthy in that regard. Also noteworthy is this modern courthouse of recent vintage in Fort Pierce, Florida. A Greek revival-inspired federal courthouse in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, is perhaps the best building Uncle Sam's post-war real estate developer, the General Services Administration, has erected in recent years. It features paintings that are apt to be meaningful to the public. Uncle Sam needs to be erecting more and better buildings akin to this courthouse in order to stand apart from the current anomie of the nation's architectural culture in the short term and contribute to that culture's renewal over the longer term. Aside from the business model issue I've raised, the advantage, in other words, of impermanent architecture lies the deeper problem embedded in the phenomenon known as modernity, a key feature of which, as Alan Bloom showed us decades ago, is the deification of the creative self. That's self with a capital S. And this entails a psychological mindset allergic to the objective standards of an impersonal tradition. Still, good things can happen where you might not expect them. And when we think of improving our civic architecture, renovation instead of demolition of bad buildings is a necessary consideration. As many of you know, the future of Manhattan's Madison Square Garden and the train station underneath it are the topic of much debate and prognostication these days. In the event the garden stays in place, here's an excellent proposal for relieving it of its ugliness. The idea is to make 8th Avenue Penn Station's new front, whereas the front of McKim's station faced 7th. A classical renovation of the garden could be a cultural game changer, and that's what we need. The Trump administration will have an important say in Penn Station's future. Let's hope it pays attention to this proposal. Let's hope Uncle Sam becomes ever more mindful of the crucial role it needs to play in sustaining the great tradition in public art and architecture and the standards of appropriateness it encompasses. Though presently countercultural, they remain absolutely indispensable to the expression of American thought as a unity. Thank you.